AfroDebt. I'm with the legal analysis and advocacy portfolio, and this is one portfolio that looks at trying to give a legal analysis and advocacy component to the debt issues that we work on at AfroDebt. Now, AfroDebt was created some 27 years ago, and has been working on issues to do with debt and development, particularly trying to improve the lives of the people on the African continent in as far as the socio-economic rights are concerned. What we look at are the debt challenges that African nations face. We've got several countries that are debt distress, several that are at a high risk of debt distress, and a lot more at a risk of debt distress. Now, it has become important for us to add a legal component to the political economy analysis that we provide to the debt question. And why is this so? We understand that the debt question is already a very important question that we need to be asking on the African continent. However, like any other issue on Africa, there's always a legal framework that should govern the same, be it on the domestic level or on the international level. And so, as AfroDebt, we have become aware that there's a very great need for us to address some of these issues, also providing a legal analysis to things, just to see how can we improve the debt question, giving a legal component to it and legal analysis to it. Now, I'm very privileged to announce that we have a paper that we have been working on that looks at the debt question, but also from a legal perspective, just trying to look at what are the legal components that we need to be thinking. How does the legal framework come into being when we're looking at the debt on the African continent? How should African governments be also thinking when they're getting into these contracts? What are the legal clauses should they be alert to when they're drafting these legal contracts? Now, this paper focuses on the legal foundations of debt. It is very important for us to also trace the history of debt on the African continent. From yesterday's discussions, there was a very pertinent question that was asked, and it was, how did we get to this position that we are at? How did we get into this crisis? And when we look back, we see that there have been a lot of phases, if I should say, that have maintained also the kind of structure that we now have when we look at the debt in the African context. So when we look at the debt question, we try to then trace these historical phases and see how they impacted the current situation that we are in. So we may notice that there are historical legacies of debt as well that need to be addressed, the colonial legacies that we left by our colonizers. We also need to look inwardly and see, for example, the mismanagement that we have also contributed as governments. And then we also need to look at the external factors, for example, the global financial architecture, how it is designed and how it continues to perpetuate these challenges that we continue to face on the African continent and as far as the debt question is concerned. And so we've got a consultant that worked on this paper, and that consultant is Dr. Leila Latif. She'll be joining us virtually. Unfortunately, she could not join us physically, but she'll be joining us virtually and she'll be presenting this paper. There's going to be a PowerPoint presentation that will be put up, and we're going to be following this for about 20 minutes. So this is going to be the format. Dr. Leila is going to present the paper for 20 minutes. Then we're going to have an esteemed panel that is going to respond to her positions. And we've got Dr. Griff Chelwa, as well as Dr. Ohio Omiyunu. So I think it's prudent in the interest of time that we have Dr. Leila present. Dr. Leila, can you hear us?
Yes, hello everybody, hi.
Hello, Dr. Leila. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I'll ask that you maybe firstly introduce yourself briefly to the audience and then get into the paper. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Hello everybody. Just like Sam said, it's unfortunate I can't be there. Some work pulled me elsewhere. My name is Leila Latif. I'm a Kenyan-based lawyer, chief executive of Leila Latif and Company, and my work focuses on a lot of research around, tax policy, illicit financial flows, and the spending policies we have for African nations. We also have a committee on fiscal studies at the University of Nairobi, and I'm currently the chair and the research lead, and I'm always happy to support AfroDebt in the fantastic work that they do. Over to you, Samantha.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leila. I think you can just go ahead and start your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. All right, so thanks everybody. After that had commissioned me to write about the legal foundations of the African public debt. So this paper goes on for about 42 pages. It discusses a lot of content, which is very relevant for us to understand in the manner in which debt is contracted, the sort of nuances behind it in terms of transparency, accountability, the liabilities, the rights and obligations that accrue as a result of the debt going forward. So I'm just going to share the structure of the paper to begin with. That's the structure of the paper. It's divided into about 8 sections, and each section logically moves and continues with the conversation about what public debt in Africa actually looks like today. So we start off from the history, we move towards the current underpinnings of debt as part of national policy, as part of the international financial architecture. We look at what theoretical underpinnings inform the narrative behind debt as we understand it, and then we move towards discussing the contractual elements of public debt. The paper in itself incorporates all of this, to some extent, discussing certain African countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, Ghana, South Africa, Nigeria, Chad. So, if you get your hands on it, it will be interesting to read it. But my presentation today is just to try and discuss this aspect of the legal foundations of review of the paper, but draw out the specific themes out of it. So we all know that public debt is a problem with economic, social. It's not only a problem; it's a problem that has economic, social, and legal impacts, which cannot be ignored. So when we look at it as an economic problem, we're seeing that public debt sometimes it can lead to reorganization of economies. It can divert resources away from growth-inducing sectors, and it can hinder long-term productivity and economic growth. It can not only are we is going to result in reduced investments in critical sectors like manufacturing and agriculture, imitating also inclusive or holding back inclusive economic growth. When we talk about public debt's economic consequences, it can also lead to imposing trade restrictions and tariffs, which can harm local industries and lead to job losses due to increased competition from, cheap imports. When we look at the social implications of public debt, right? So implementing austerity measures that disproportionately will affect healthcare and education. So if we look at Zambia, right? Zambia's escalating debt servicing costs, for example, have led to reduced government spending on healthcare, resulting in strained healthcare systems, inadequate medical supplies, and increased patient-to-doctor ratios. Public debt can actually even worsen income inequality, as was evidenced in Mozambique's hidden debt scandal case, which basically suspended donor support and triggered severe austerity measures that then disproportionately impacted the poorer segments of society. Then we need to think about public debt from the legal perspective, right? So from a legal perspective, managing public debt kind of raises complex issues. There's the concept of odious debt, and that arises when debt is incurred against the best interests of the people, which sparks contentious legal debates. Now, legal disputes can also emerge from this aspect of contingent liabilities, such as when, governments guarantee debts or enter public-private partnerships. So, for example, in South Africa, the government has had to assume the debt burden of defaulted state-owned enterprises, straining public finances and triggering legal implications regarding the government's financial obligations. So what we're seeing is that the issue of public debt is not just a matter of fiscal policy, but it is an issue that permeates the entirety of a nation's fabric. That is why we must understand how public debt is contracted, how it's managed, what it is spent on, how the spending occurs, and the sort of implications that underpin public debt. Now, to understand all of this, that paper basically argues that we've got to step back into history, right? Public debt structure is really a product of colonial dominance and a shift of post-colonial states into capitalism. So historically, public debt was often incurred for the exploitation and expropriation of raw materials from colonies, leaving these countries resource depleted and debt-ridden. And the capitalist influences on public debt are also pretty evident. When debt is provided to African countries, the conditions usually favor the creditors, right? So the goal is to secure an interest and make a profit. That's the idea behind public debt, pushing debtor states to use borrowed funds to ensure a return on investment for the creditors. So this can mean public debt isn't used for public services like education and health, and we need to be wary about that. But now we're starting to also see, despite the fact that public debt was bad in its conception during the colonial period, and the fact that it has translated into a lot of profit making for some of these creditor countries, we're now also starting to see some theoretical perspectives that advocate for a more humane approach to public debt. We're looking at economic analysis and human rights interpretations that argue for models like the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, which allows for debt forgiveness for the poorest countries. There is the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, the Paris Club's Coordinated Solutions, and the G20's Debt Service Suspension Initiative. All these embody this shift towards integrating human rights considerations into the realm of public debt, right? So by prioritizing human well-being and sustainable development, we're seeing that these initiatives are trying to pave the way for a more equitable approach to tackling public debt issues in the African continent. However, you will also argue that more work remains in establishing sort of preventive measures against unsustainable debt levels and ensuring the full realization of economic and social rights for all of us. We know that African countries face severe public debt challenges. And while these initiatives, the ones that are highlighted in red on the screen, they do offer some relief, they also face a lot of criticisms. So the HIPC and MDRI, they have strict eligibility criteria and limited scopes, often leaving many, many African countries still burdened with substantial debt. The Paris Club itself has been criticized for repeated rescheduling without addressing root causes of debt, while the last one, the DSSI, on the screen, only offers temporary relief and doesn't cover all types of debt. The G20's common framework, with limited African representation, because only South Africa happens to be the member from all the other G20 representatives, they may not fully, or South Africa may not fully itself address the continent's diverse debt challenges. So there is a growing need for more inclusive, sustainable mechanisms that can effectively handle Africa's unique public debt issues and ensure it doesn't hinder human rights and sustainable development. So this is the pitch that the paper makes in the first 10 pages when it gets into this discussion about history, colonialism, capitalism, and the sort of initiatives that we're seeing, at the international platform in how to mitigate some of these debt concerns that many African countries are seeing. Yes?
Sorry to cut you off.
Yes, Samantha?
Yes, sorry to cut you off. So we have French-speaking people within our audience, and it's a bit difficult for the interpreters to interpret because of the speed. So very sorry for.
Oh gosh.
I should have started with that. So maybe if you could just take it a bit slow.
So slower. Oh, okay. Gosh. Okay. I'll do my best. I'm just naturally a very fast speaker. I really apologize. So basically, I was saying that if we want to manage public debt effectively in Kenya, we need to look at the laws, the regulations, and the rules that are in place. And currently, when you read the paper, you will see a discussion that explains that these rules that we have in African countries, right, are fragmented across various constitutions and statutes, ministerial directives and rules. There is no single law that fully addresses public debt. And this fragmentation, coupled with the a lack of transparency and accountability, it makes it tough to hold governments accountable for how they handle and manage and even contract public debt. So we've also got regional groups in Africa that are trying to establish, public debt thresholds. For instance, in West Africa, we have WAIMU. The public debt, basically for West Africa, the public debt should not exceed 70% of GDP. Now, in the SADC region, the Southern African region, the public debt ratio should be maintained at below 60% of GDP. And then the central part, the member states are required to maintain a public debt ratio of, I think, to keep it below 70% of GDP, and then come to East Africa, right? Kenya, Tanzania, etc. East Africa has a slightly more stringent debt limit of 50% of GDP in net present value terms, but countries often ignore this limit that they set. So Rwanda, for example, it has a public debt ratio of 66.7% of GDP, and Burundi has 66.4% of GDP. So Kenya itself is beginning to increase its ratio to 55% upon the last amendment that the government had publicized for gathering public comments. 55%, right? And the East Africa threshold is 50%. So clearly we're not even respecting these thresholds that we're agreeing as governments in terms of limiting public debt. Now, the process of contracting public debt, therefore, isn't uniform, right? With transparency, accountability, and oversight actually being a hit or a miss. So to truly understand and effectively manage public debt in Africa, we've got to delve into history, move towards more humane debt management models, and then develop, comprehensive legal frameworks for public debt. We need transparency and accountability to tackle the challenges we face with public debt. So poor management of public debt, the paper argues, can lead to financial instability, crowding out of private sector investment, and also eroding public trust. But in the process of managing public debt, the paper argued basically that there are 4 key legal instruments and structures that guide the entire process going forward, right? So we've got the debt sustainability frameworks, which are usually used by international financial institutions like IMF, World Bank, even the Africa Development Bank. These frameworks assess a country's ability to service its external and public debt without resorting to debt relief or incurring unsustainable debt. Then you know this from your own countries. Your government will always come up with medium-term debt management strategies. You know also from your country's legal framework that we have public financial management systems like various countries, example, Kenya, South Africa, Ghana. We've got the Public Finance Management Act that covers the entire cycle of public finance operations, including revenue mobilization, budgeting, expenditure management. You see, so this is what I'm talking about, the fragmentation. So we have the public financial management that discusses not only aspects of debt, but other sources, other alternative, other, rooms to be able to now go ahead and mobilize revenue from different sources. We don't have a specific statute that says this is the position, the vision, the policy, the strategy the government has on contracting, processing, and accounting for public debt. Then the fourth instrument, the fourth structure that is there is the Debt Management Office. Now, these are usually specialized agencies. They're tasked with managing the nation's debt portfolio, and they ensure that the government's financing needs are met at the lowest possible cost and risk. But we've seen that's not really the case from what's going on in Zambia, in Kenya, and other countries that are moving towards, high incidences of debt. So effective public debt management in Africa, it entails not only focusing on strategies to procure debt management, like the 4, institutions and structures that you just saw, but also placing keen attention to the subsequent, to the subsequent management of that debt, making it flexible, adaptable, and capable of responding to the shifting dynamics of global markets and the nation's own evolving economic landscape. I feel that attention must also be paid to the significant legal considerations for both creditors and borrowers aiming to preserve debt sustainability. For instance, there's a lot of content on the slide here, but what is important is that when we're thinking about public debt, we need to think as lawyers, what are the contractual obligations that we're looking at in designing this public debt instrument? We've got to ask ourselves, what are the regulatory compliances that are going to bind the way in which this debt is going to be now properly processed and implemented in the country? We've got to think about what is the collateral security that has been offered, because loans are backed by collateral. What are the rules regarding the rights to seize and liquidate the collateral in case of default? It's crucial for us to be able to engage in these discussions with governments, but governments have to be open and transparent in sharing this information with the public, that we're going to be borrowing from so-and-so, and as collateral we are attaching our port or our airport, right? So that there's public consultation on this. As lawyers, we also have to look at bankruptcy laws. We've got to understand what laws in our countries are key for debt sustainability. So in case the state becomes insolvent or the state parastatal becomes insolvent, right? They might be eligible to discharge their debt via bankruptcy. I don't know. These laws, however, they vary widely, and they have significant implications for both parties. Even in terms of these legal obligations, as we think about debt and the sort of obligations it brings into the country, we've got to ask ourselves, to what extent is there transparency and disclosure? And then what sort of debt restructuring and refinancing models are we also going to be creating in the event we cannot manage to pay back the public debt? Not only that, we also have to think about consumer protection laws, right? Fiscal austerity can be imposed on a nation where the state now has to start servicing debt and it doesn't have enough revenue that it collects from the people. But what does fiscal austerity do to the social fabric of society, right? It hurts the most vulnerable. It hurts the informal sector. It hurts the workers. So how are we responding to that? And those are the things we need to think about when we're looking into public debt and its consequences. So the issue here is, transparency. The lack of transparency and clarity about the extent of indebtedness can seriously hamper the ability of governments to make sound decisions about borrowing, thereby underscoring the need for what you call this adherence to sound public debt management legal frameworks, publishing key public debt statistics annually, and limiting the scope of confidentiality in borrowing contracts. We need all this if we're going to be having a system where public debt is very transparent for the people involved to be able to now provide their comments going forward on that. So the paper in itself, when you get a hold of it, the discussion there is self-explanatory about these 7 key points, the 7 key legal considerations that you're seeing up there. But now, I've talked about transparency, accountability, which is usually an issue when it comes to public debt contracting. Now, to gauge the transparency and quality of debt reporting practices, there are certain tools that have been already developed. And one of them you see here is this one here, right? Is the Debt Transparency Monitor, which has been developed by the USAID, and on this side is the debt reporting heat map by the World Bank, and they have proven to be invaluable, right? So you just have to go and Google, type in these words, and you're going to get the document from USAID that explains in which that they understand how public debt has to be monitored in terms of transparency. And then the heat map from the World Bank actually lists many, many countries that have already strong legal and regulatory frameworks that provide some of this reporting. Red simply means that there is insufficient data about that specific issue when it comes to debt reporting for that country. Green actually green actually means that there's full reporting that the government is providing. And you will see in terms of Benin is actually all green, apart from the last block where it's yellow, which means there's partial reporting. So, and then you have Burkina Faso that's actually ranked really well in terms of debt reporting. So it's come out as the stronger country in Africa when it comes to providing accountability and transparency in the way in which public debt has been managed for it. Okay, then we now have the other aspect about obstructions, right? So we're not only going to talk about public debt, and we're going to say public debt, has issues to do with transparency and accountability because the legal regulatory framework is not strong enough to push the government to be more accountable for the people. Therefore, there's a lot of discretion in terms of generating public debt. But not only this, there are other issues when it comes to public debt. There's certain obstructions that the paper engages in discussing, and these obstructions are about 5. There happens to be varied legal definitions of public debt across countries, right? Such as in Nigeria. And this, for example, the way the state will define public debt, it's going to define it in a way that it doesn't consider maybe the debt of parastatals as public debt, right? You've got to be able to read the paper to be able to see some of the examples that have been given there. And these varied legal definitions of public debt can cause discrepancies in measuring and reporting on public debt. And the consequence of this is that it goes ahead to undermine transparency initiatives. Then there's also the problem of delegation at governance issues. And it's been exemplified by Kenya, for example, right? This can lead to inconsistencies in debt management and transparency due to fragmented responsibilities among institutions. So our constitution says that Parliament must give its approval. But at the same time, we have the Public Finance Management Act that kind of gives different instructions, right? So you've got different bodies with different powers, different mandates to be able to now go ahead and make decisions on contracting public debt. And if they don't talk to each other, then we have that fragmented responsibilities, which is not good in the overrun for transparency. The third aspect is this aspect of reporting practices and confidentiality clauses. These can limit transparency. Like, for example, in Ghana, the loan agreements contain confidentiality clauses that prevent crucial debt information disclosure. The issue of contingent liabilities is also a real threat to public debt, right? Because it adds to public debt when the intention was never to get some of these PPP joint ventures with foreign creditors to, we didn't want to take them as debt in terms of forming that PPP. But when you have that public parastatal default, then the sovereign has to pay for it. So then that contingent liability becomes part and parcel of public debt. And these are often unmonitored and unreported. And because of that, it poses challenges for accurate debt assessment, right? Then we've got accountability, very key. It's crucially linked to transparency. And both accountability and transparency, they can be undermined by political and institutional factors which restrict public debate and oversight. I think Zimbabwe illustrates this issue. Zambia as well illustrates this issue. In Zimbabwe, there was a recent High Court ruling that has emphasized the importance of parliamentary oversight in promoting transparency and accountability. But saying all this, right, we come now to AFRODAT. And AFRODAT has the African Borrowing Charter, which offers a framework to address these obstructions that you're seeing on the slide, right? So the Charter addresses how countries can get to effective public debt management. It provides a sort of a universal definition of public debt. It promotes transparency. The good thing it does is that it also clarifies the roles and responsibilities, right, involved, the challenges in terms of current reporting practices, and it emphasizes on accountability. So by implementing the Charter's principles and recommendations as part of national policy, national strategy, national laws, and regulations on public debt, African countries can improve transparency, they can promote responsible borrowing, and they can enhance coordination and also strengthen, most importantly, the oversight mechanism. Okay, finally, right? Before I'm told to stop as well, because I'm not sure if I'm in my 20 minutes or gone beyond, I'm sorry. But now, once you get to read the paper and go through the myriad of challenges, issues, etc., that have been identified, the last part of the paper makes some key recommendations. And these recommendations have been taken from looking at how Ghana, Ethiopia, Chad, South Africa, Kenya, etc., have had issues that have not proved to be feasible for, the long-term sustainability of public debt. Number one, we've got that aspect of constitutional reforms, right? We've got to implement constitutionally mandated debt limits to maintain fiscal discipline. Okay, it's not enough to be able to say as East Africa, we say the threshold will be at 50%. It's got to be in the constitution. And this could serve as a top-tier legal guide for public debt management, despite its politically sensitive nature, right? Then we need statutory reforms. So we've got to update or implement new laws and regulations that are related to public debt management to enhance clarity and establish robust oversight mechanisms. Really, really key. Then we need to think about debt management strategy reforms. So how do we do that? We need to think about it in terms of developing and regularly updating comprehensive debt management strategies that guide borrowing decisions and reduce risks. Kenya does a good job at this, but Chad does not, right? So maybe Chad can learn from the Kenyan experience. Then we've got coordination reforms. We've got to be able to improve coordination among entities involved in debt management to ensure consistency in decision-making and reporting, because this happens to flag out in majority of the countries that the paper has looked into. The fifth part is in the green one there is the independent, we need to have an independent debt management office. So let's think about establishing independent DMOs to ensure informed decision-making on debt matters without political interference, which can further enhance investor confidence. Now, the second last point is in terms of comprehensive reporting to Parliament. Initially, I talked about contingent liabilities. They're not reported, they're not published. It causes a concern. It causes a fiscal drain on many states. So we need to get governments to provide Parliament with comprehensive information on contingent liabilities, ensuring their involvement in the decision-making process. Parliament should have the authority to monitor and assess all forms of debt, including contingent liabilities, right? Because this is going to end up fostering debt transparency, it's going to strengthen fiscal discipline, and it will mitigate the risks that are associated with these contingent liabilities. And then finally, right, we've got to talk about responsible lending and borrowing practices. Honestly, like both borrowing governments and creditors should adopt proactive measures to ensure responsible lending and borrowing. It shouldn't be like a free fall. Every time you can run to the US or to Europe and just start getting loans, and those creditors don't really do an assessment to be like, why should we give you a loan? I mean, how is our loan going to impact your long-term sustainability? That really needs to be pegged in, right? So the borrowing governments should conduct rigorous due diligence and risk analysis during the public-private partnerships procurement process, for example, right? This would include comprehensive financial assessments to ensure project viability and sustainability. Some countries do this, other countries are not doing this. There needs to be a robust monitoring mechanism for PPP projects, right? That should be established to track performance and identify potential risks. Then we also need to think about regular re-evaluation of projects. This is so crucial to confirm their ongoing viability. So we don't have to wait for IMF to come and do that risk assessment for us and then write a report and say what worked, what did not work. Parliament should be able to do this. Government should be able to do this. And the creditors themselves should conduct comprehensive due diligence as well to verify, right, that borrowing governments do not exceed their debt 30%. If it's going to go beyond, they should refuse to give the loan. But again, that's a political debate. So proactive lending practices and close communication with borrowing governments will help avoid contributing to unsustainable debt levels. This is what the creditor nations should also be thinking about. So ladies and gentlemen, this is in a nutshell in terms of the main arguments, the key points, the salient features that have been discussed in the paper. And like I said, if you can get a hold of it, the information that's provided there provides more examples, gets into deeper discussions. But my task was to simply give you an overview about what really is the legal foundation of African public debt. So thank you for listening to me. I'm going to now hand over to Samantha.
A big round of applause for Dr. Leila, please.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leila, for such an insightful presentation. I think what is really important for us is to understand the legal underpinnings of the debt question, to understand the theoretical underpinnings of the debt question, where we're coming from, where we are, and where we are going, and how the law relates to all of these issues that we're looking at. The very idea of this paper is to advance policy perspectives in as far as the legal implications and connotations of debt are concerned, particularly also looking at how we can then come in as the legal profession to ensure that we advance a change that ensures that the African governments are able to, practice responsible lending in the long run. And so, before I go any further, we would like to acknowledge the presence of the Attorney General of the Republic of Zambia, Honorable Mlilo Kabesha. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. We're really honored and delighted to have you join us. Once again, thank you very much, Dr. Leila, for your presentation. Let me just say, this is just but one phase of the work that we're doing as AfroDebt. We're trying to ensure that we look at the debt question using a multidimensional approach where we're not only applying a political economy analysis to it, but also a legal analysis and advocacy component to it. What is very important for us is to acknowledge that, yes, while strategic public interest litigation is possible and is a tool that we can use to ensure that we have got sustainable borrowing and lending practices that are happening on the African continent, we think that the devil is in the contracts. We need to look at the provisions of the contract and see if the terms and conditions are favorable to us and if they're not, aiding debt trap in the end. And so it's very important for us to look at the contracts themselves and see if it's very possible for the African continent to have a legal framework that just guides how debt contracts are managed, debt contracts are formulated. And so it's very important for us to have a uniform and shared understanding of the legal underpinnings of debt so that we may be able to have such a tool in the future. Now, just an announcement, there is a registration form that is circulating. Please ensure that you fill in that form. Would be really grateful if you did that. So now we'll have the panelists respond to Dr. Leila's paper. Like I said, this is just but one phase of the project that we're working on. And so it's very important for us to have a shared understanding and also to have all of our input into this paper so that we have a very improved paper that speaks to these data implications and connotations from a legal perspective. And so I'll ask Dr. Grieve Chelwa to come first and share his comments and insights in as far as Dr. Leila's presentation is concerned. Dr. Chelwa, please.
Thanks, Samantha. Is it okay if I talk from here? Okay. All right. Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to congratulate Dr. Latif for her presentation and for her paper. I read the paper with great interest. It's a really fascinating paper, and I hope at some point AfroDebt will circulate it if it's possible with people who are attending here if they haven't done that already, because it's a very useful paper. So again, I like to put a disclaimer. I'm in a room full of lawyers. I think disclaimer is a legal principle. I'm an economist, so bear with me because this is new terrain for me. So let's see how it goes. But I'd like to say the one thing that this paper does very well, it makes a very strong argument that public debt okay. I think the one thing that this paper does very well is that it makes the argument that public debt is not just a political, economic, and social phenomenon, but it's actually a legal phenomenon as well. And this is something that I was quite ignorant about before I came to this conference and even before I read this paper. And that's even important. And it seems to me from reading the paper that it's crucially a legal phenomenon, because once the idea to contract the debt has been resolved, once the question of should we go and borrow, once that question has been resolved, and often that question might be a political question, an economic question, a social question, then the machinery of the contracting happens, right? The clauses are written, the contract is written, the devil is hidden in the details, to paraphrase what Samantha just said. So I think that's really an important aspect, and I think it in many ways reinforces the gathering that's happening this week here under the theme of sovereign debt and the legal profession. So I think that's incredibly important. And even for me as an economist, as I go away from this conference, I need to talk more to my friends in the legal profession. So I'll talk very briefly about some of the key points from the paper as I took them. So the first thing that Dr. Latif does is she makes a very strong argument that public debt has a colonial origin. And I think many of us lose sight of this particular aspect, right? We often think about, for example, Zambia's debt, we think of it as a contemporary thing. The Zambia's debt today, we think of it as something just happened in the last 10 years. Yes, it's true. It was accumulated over the last 10 years, as the Honorable Attorney General illustrated last year, and often accrued in a very dangerous, reckless way. But it's also important to understand that the accrual of the debt today can be traced back to the colonial times. And this is essentially what Dr. Latif is arguing in her paper, right? For example, she says, borrowing to fund the colonial project and paying for the colonial project itself left a debt, right? So let me give a concrete example. For example, in the case of Zambia. So when one looks at Zambia's infrastructure map, we tend to see that a big part of Zambia's infrastructure map is concentrated along what is called the line of rail. That the line of rail that runs from the Copperbelt province in sort of the north up until here in south in Livingstone in the south, right? Now, this is not an accident. This is really a legacy of colonialism. Because why is this infrastructure concentrated along the line of rail? Precisely because the colonial administrators were interested in one thing, and that thing was copper. How do we get the copper from the Copperbelt province? And then how do we get it extracted from the Copperbelt province in its raw form, export it through Livingstone into the world, right? So essentially, you can imagine that that line of rail, to put up that line of rail, debt had to be accumulated, right? And what Dr. Latif is arguing in her paper, that at independence in 1964, in the case of Zambia, right, the transfer of debt was then transfer of debt to former colonies without the consent of the previously colonized, right? So again, so we have two phenomena that are at play here. We've got a concentration of infrastructure that is supposed to support extraction of resources, right? And at the same time, these newly independent countries acquire this debt, right? So there's a debt that's passed on to us that when we struggle to pay. I'd also like to make a much more concrete example in the case of Zambia, which I think explains the country's debt dynamics of the last 50 years. So Zambia became a British protectorate sometime in the 1920s, maybe 1924. At about this 1924, with minerals, copper is discovered in the country, right? So the people who discover copper are then granted the rights to exploit and extract this copper, right? It's a question for another time who really granted them those rights and whatever. Anyways, so they're given the rights to exploit this copper. Now, at independence in 1964, we are forced to recognize the rights that these folks who discovered copper have, right? So we're forced to recognize those rights. But again, we realize that we need this copper to fund our development project. We need this copper to fund our development project. So the first government is at a loss. On the one hand, we have copper in the ground that is not ours, because the rights to mine that copper was given to was given by the colonial administrators to companies. But we need this particular copper to fund our development initiatives. So what do we do, right? So in 1969 thereabout, we nationalize copper industry, right? So often nationalization, I think in this particular case, it wasn't an outright nationalization, because what we did is we were honorable men and women. So what did we do? We said, what's the value of these rights? We're going to pay you for them. We're going to pay you for them so that we can use this copper industry to fund our own development. So to pay for things that were in originally ours, we issued public bonds. We issued what are called ZIMCO bonds. So we issued debt to be able to purchase back the right to be able to purchase back the minerals that were ours in the first instance, and then use those minerals to fund development. But what is crucially important to understand here, and I think this is the argument that Dr. Latif is making, is that debt, right, and just debt in many ways, this set up the country sets the country up in a perpetual debt cycle, because then we spend the next 20, 30 years or so trying to pay back this debt, trying to pay back the ZIMCO bonds that we had to issue to do what? We had to issue in order to buy back the rights to use our own minerals to fund our own development. So it's important here to understand that debt, public debt, has a colonial origin in this way that I've illustrated in the case of Zambia, right? Also, it has a colonial origin in the sense that many African governments today are fighting to close infrastructural gaps. And much of these infrastructural gaps, again, are steeped in colonialism. And now often we say colonialism is a 60s old thing. Why did you bring it up again here? Again, I illustrate it in the case of Zambia. If you look at Zambia's infrastructure, concentrated along the line of rail. So governments since independence have been struggling to increase infrastructure beyond the line of rail. And to do that, often they've had to incur debt, right? In this. So again, this is also important to understand that debt has a colonial origin in it, right? So this is also one important part of the work that Dr. Latif does. So she argues here that public debt accumulation, both pre-colonial and post-colonial, has perpetuated economic dependency and reinforced the dominance of external actors. I mean, the point is just to make that public debt, which has its origin in colonialism, and again, it's ramped up in the immediate post-colonial era in the way I just illustrated in the case of Zambia, has then perpetuated economic dependency and reinforced the dominance of external actors, right? Yeah, so this is one part of what I take away from this paper, this argument that public debt has a colonial origin. Then the other part that the paper makes, so one part is telling us where this debt comes from. The second part of it is really then honing on this argument that on the importance of law in thinking about public debt. So she argues in the paper that public debt is a creature of contract law, right? She argues that public debt is really a creature of contract law in the sense that once the decision to accumulate the debt has been decided, now the lawyers go to work, right? And the lawyers write up the contracts, the lawyers write up all the sort of clauses that really sort of give life to the debt, as well as have discussions about how the debt is managed. And in doing this work, what Dr. Latif does is she looks at two levels of law. She looks at the national law and as well as international law. Right, national law as it exists in African countries. And here she makes the argument that most constitutions in the African case do not have oversight mechanisms or clauses around debt contraction and debt management. And that is important. And I think the Honorable Attorney General made the argument yesterday that in the Zambian case, we now have a new law that requires parliamentary approval for the contraction of debt, which is important. Also, what I'd like to see in the Zambian case as well is, in some ways, whether parliamentary approval, for example, when Zambia got an IMF agreement and we got an IMF deal, this agreement was signed by the Zambian government. But I think what one would like to see is the question being put back to the Zambian people, right? Zambian people, ladies and gentlemen, citizens of Zambia, do you agree to subject yourself to these conditions, which many have argued and many have showed can be punitive, right? What are called austerity conditions. I was very fascinated to see, for example, Greece. When Greece wanted to agree to an IMF deal, what Greece did is they subjected that question, they took that question back to the people. Well, they even went so far, they didn't just end up at parliament, but they took it to a referendum. And they says, people of Greece, do you want to get on an IMF program? Vote yes or no. And I think that referendum was that question was defeated. People of Greece said no, they didn't want to be subject to that. So, anyways, what Dr. Latif is arguing here, she shows that most constitutions in the African case do not have clauses or do not have oversight or clauses around debt contraction. And then when you look at subsidiary legislation, again, what we do see in the African case is that public debt management in subsidiary legislation is often fragmented, right? So she's arguing here that there is no coordinated legal infrastructure or legal framework that allows us to think about public debt management, public debt contraction, and so on and so forth. So that's at the level of national law. Then at the level of international law, as you can imagine, this is important because much of the debt that Africa is accumulating is often external debt. So debt that is denominated in US dollars, or it's denominated in euros, or it's denominated in Japanese yen, and so on and so forth. So therefore, we're going to have some aspect of international law. What Dr. Latif says in her studying of international law vis-a-vis African public debt, she argues here that there are various treaties and constellation of laws, norms, and guidelines often that grant power to creditor nations and creditor entities. So she's essentially saying, even though we've got like a tradition of international law that's supposed to guide how debt is contracted across international borders, in the African case, much of this law is is written in such a way, even though it's written in neutral language, it turns out that it grants a lot of power to creditor nations, right? And I don't need to hammer on that point here because we know, right? For example, Zambia has struggled to be able to restructure its debt. It's taken almost 2 years to do it, and part of it is because there's a power imbalance there. Even though we can appeal to international law, we can appeal to international treaties, we can appeal to international financial institutions. In doing so, we appeal to them at a level of power subservience, right? This is the argument that Dr. Latif is making. And in terms of international financial institutions, she talks about debt sustainability analysis, which are often performed by the IMF and World Bank, which forms part of international law, right? So we need to do a DSA, debt sustainability analysis, to see, is Zambia indebted? Is Africa indebted? And even in that kind of work, it seems like it's objective science, but it's often, the analysis is often conducted to penalize the African continent. The judge yesterday made the argument that Africa's debt is $600 billion, right? That seems like a big number. However, our economy, the size of our economy is 3 trillion on the African continent. On the other hand, the US economy, the size of the US economy is $15 trillion. And guess what the size of their debt is? $30 trillion. So their debt is twice the size of their economy, whereas in our case, our debt is almost a third the size of our economy, and yet we are the ones who have a debt crisis, right? So again, there's a lot of interesting language when one begins to think about debt and the law around debt and legal frameworks around the management of debt. Okay, so in the 2 minutes or so that I have remaining, I'd like to just discuss a little bit some of the recommendations that come out of this paper. So Dr. Latif talks about constitutional reforms. We need constitutional reforms. I agree. In the case I just illustrated, debt limits, parliamentary approval for debt accumulation. I'd even argue that even for signing up to IMF programs, we also need to seek parliamentary approval at the minimum, or even if we're ambitious enough in the case of Greece, we take it to a referendum, because that's important. After all, it's a public debt. It's debt that the public owe, right? She talks about statutory reforms, and that's actually true. Debt management reforms, I agree with that. She talks about coordination reforms because of this fragmented nature of the law that's supposed to govern and that's supposed to guide in terms of debt management, right? In most African countries, we have laws around debt management, but those laws are fragmented, are scattered around, and she argues that we need a coordinated, coherent approach to doing that. I agree with her. She also talks about transparency and accountability, and I think that does not need any further discussion. I think it's true, it's public debt, so we need transparency. We need to be able to see the contracts. We need to be able to contribute to the way the contracts are structured. We need to be able to participate as well when it comes to discussions about debt restructuring. But the last point that I would like to discuss and disagree with slightly from Dr. Latif is she argues for independent debt management officers. Now, I like to argue slightly against this point using the case of central bank independence. In the African case, many of our central banks are independent. And that in its, at face value, that sounds like a great idea. We have a Bank of Zambia that is independent, right? Independent of the body politics. And that sounds like a great idea. But the problem is the work of the Bank of Zambia is so important to economic development, right? And what has happened, for example, in the case of the Bank of Zambia, is that because the Bank of Zambia is independent, the Bank of Zambia only focuses on one thing, which is inflation. The Bank of Zambia's interest is to maintain price stability. Now, that's great, but guess what? The Bank of Zambia is so important that it should also focus on issues of economic development and issues of industrialization. But because it's independent, its hands are tied. Its hands are tied to the extent that it can only focus on price stability. Similarly, I worry that if we have an independent debt management office, right, this debt management office its hands may be tied to say, for example, that we're an independent debt management office and we're denying you, Zambia, that you cannot breach the 60% debt threshold. And that's that. Oh, but we've got a railway to put up. We've got a power station to put up. Right? We've got a highway to build. We've got a bridge to build. In this moment, we really do need to to incur in this particular expenditure. But the debt management office will say, we refuse to sign off, and that's that because we're technocrats, we're focused on this one thing, you gotta go away. So essentially is to say, I think the idea of an independent debt management office is an interesting one, but we have to consider it, given that public debt is not just a legal phenomenon, it's a political phenomenon, it's a social phenomenon, it's economic phenomenon. It's important that this particular office is placed in this larger political, economic, social, legal context. All this to say that this is an incredibly fascinating paper with so many parts to it, and it's impossible to do justice to it in these remarks that I've given. But I think it pushes us a long way in thinking about the current debt crisis in Africa and the law of the legal profession in abating or enabling that particular crisis. Thank you so much, Madam Mr. Solomons. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Grieve Chelwa, for your very insightful comments and a very detailed review of the paper. We really appreciate your input. Maybe at this point, we can turn to Dr. Ohio Myun. Doc.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Latif, for an excellent paper. And it was a joy to read, really insightful. And I think it responds to a number of the questions that were raised yesterday. So I believe that when this is ready, it will be a good resource, both for practitioners and policymakers. And obviously on that point, I think perhaps the first thing I would like to raise that Dr. Latif would want to consider in the revision or the updated version of this particular piece is to think about the length, or perhaps, maybe there might be a need to have a short-term or abridged version that policymakers, practitioners can easily digest in terms of its the way it distills very important and practical insight into the legal framework for public debt and public debt management and public debt contracting in Africa. I think also Dr. Latif's work adds to a body of growing literature, which has been done by a number of organizations, including the African Union Commission. I recall 2 years ago that there was a report done which touched along these similar lines in terms of trying to map out the legal framework for debt, public debt, contracting management across the African continent. So this is a very important contribution. And I congratulate Dr. Latif for the brilliant work that's been done even on this first draft. It was excellent to read. So as not to restate what my colleague has already dealt with, and you kept on giving the caveats of you being an economist, but that was expertly done from a legal perspective. So there were a number of things that came to mind. And number one is that Dr. Latif does a very important task, which is historicizing the crisis and the origins. We need to historicize more, because a key question that came up yesterday was, how did we get here? What are the origins of this debt? And we cannot answer that question holistically if we do not have a wider or broader picture of the origins of public debt, as a concept, a process, the mechanisms, and the laws that frame it's the process. And Dr. Latif does an excellent work in taking us back to the pre-colonial times. And I've actually found that part of the work very, very intriguing. So Dr. Latif tries to tease out what debt contracting or public debt processes looked like pre-colonial times. And that's a very useful contribution to the discourse, to the literature. A little point, just to point out there that there was a danger of generalizing, that there was a kind of uniform approach to the way pre-colonial African societies engaged with debt. And so there might be a need to maybe perhaps pick some specific examples to use to contextualize what I believe is a very important contribution of this particular piece. So overall, the paper provides the historical context, background information, which helps anyone who will read the final piece to understand the evolution of debt practices from pre-colonial African societies to the present. So it's a very compelling exploration of the origins of public debt in Africa. But I also believe that it could benefit from a more nuanced approach that includes specific data and focus on specific examples to contextualize the discussion. That would also help to balance the perspectives being offered by the paper. And it would also highlight and center the continent's cultural and economic diversity. And in doing so, I also encourage Dr. Latif to perhaps consider the fact that there's a good use of country examples, both in terms of how the practices have originated and evolved over time in countries such as Uganda, Nigeria, Chad, Angola, Kenya, Senegal, Botswana, and DRC, to mention a few. But I think there's still not a broad enough representation of the continent states. And so there might be a need to look at North African examples. So there needs to be more inclusivity in looking at broader and wider examples if we want to have a clearer picture of what public debt and public debt management looks like across the African continent. That makes it more useful to a lot of policymakers, especially, for instance, within the African Union and other institutions, and for practitioners that come from different jurisdictions that are represented here as well. Also, another aspect of the paper that I think is very important, and this was highlighted in Dr. Latif's presentation today, is the fact that we need to think about how to address the fragmented nature of the definition of public debt across African countries. And I would like to draw Dr. Latif's attention to that there are some examples that she might want to look at, such as in Mauritius, where there's been an attempt to have a more expansive or broad definition that captures a number of the issues that she raises, especially the issues related to contingent liabilities. So the Mauritius definition of public debt is expansive enough to cover such issues, because that's an area to watch or a space to watch, because it offers an avenue for the African debt crisis to even get even more exacerbated. So that's an area that needs to be watched, and there are examples of good practice from some African countries that have defined their public debt in a way that it encompasses some of this type of issues. Another example perhaps that Dr. Latif would want to look at is Uganda as well, Rwanda and Madagascar. So there are some examples that Dr. Latif can draw on. I have more detailed comments that I would be passing over to the AFUDA team to pass on to Dr. Latif. But a final point that I would like to raise is that a lot of the processes that already exist and the calls for reforms are welcome and are needed. I think a key question we need to ask ourselves, and perhaps I would want to throw that to the audience as well as to Dr. Latif, is that, and it was a question raised yesterday, what do we do when we have these processes, but the processes are not followed? What are the implications or the consequences? Do we look at sanction regimes, for instance? How do we hold our policymakers? How do we hold politicians accountable when they do not follow the processes that are in place? Also, data is a very important point, and I could see that Dr. Latif is drawing on a lot of the data that comes from a lot of these Western institutions, which I would say shows that we have a gap with respect to being able to generate the data we need to monitor debt and on the continent. There have been discussions, for instance, within the African Union talking about a debt African debt observatory. Do we need to generate or create ways in capturing this data so that African governments are able to have the necessary data without having to call on the World Bank? Because sometimes we believe that some of this information that comes from these sources is skewed and doesn't necessarily always favor the African position on this matter. So this is just among a few points that I feel that Dr. Latif should perhaps draw kind of consider in the revision of this particular paper, but I've been given a time warning. So I would stop at that point and we look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ohio. We really appreciate your comments and we look forward to your very detailed comments so that we may be able to improve this paper. Like I said, this paper is a very important piece of the bigger project that we're working on. The idea is to ensure that we inform policy perspectives that ensure that African governments are able to practice sustainable lending and borrowing processes. Also as well, following due process when doing this borrowing business. Now, I would love to extend an invitation to the audience to participate in this discussion. We really need your views and your comments so that we may be able to have a very perfect, so as to say, paper with us so that we may be able to share also with our policymakers. So I'll start from that end. So I'll have the gentleman in the front first, and then one behind him. And then I'll move to Mokasini. Then I'll have a second round. Thank you.
Merci, madame. Au moins, il y aura quelqu'un qui va parler français dans cette salle. Ça permet aux francophones aussi de se faire entendre. Je suis Kofi Sylvain Atomensan. Je suis avocat, je viens du Togo. Je suis au comité exécutif du PALU. Je voudrais d'abord remercier les deux derniers intervenants que j'ai suivis lorsque je suis rentré dans la salle. J'étais avec les femmes. Et dire que je partage amplement leur analyse. Mais la question qui me revient à l'esprit, c'est de savoir d'abord comment sont nées ces dettes. On a dit que c'est des dettes coloniales. Mais quand nous allons les contracter, quel rôle nous donnons aux avocats de nos pays, de nos divers barreaux? Lorsque nos dirigeants vont négocier les dossiers de crédit, quelle place donnent-ils aux avocats? Aux avocats de leur pays. Ils vont plutôt chercher de gros cabinets en Europe pour les accompagner, pour aller traiter de dettes qui concernent nos pays, alors que nous sommes indépendants depuis des années et que nous disons des pays souverains. La question maintenant de savoir quelle place nos dirigeants donnent à leurs associations d'avocats, aux cabinets d'avocats africains, lorsqu'ils vont négocier les dettes ou ils vont créer de nouvelles dettes que nos enfants vont payer. Donc, il s'agit de réfléchir à une stratégie pour qu'au niveau de l'Union africaine, le groupe de travail qui travaille sur cette question-là puisse se voir associer des avocats qui sont intéressés par la question de la dette et de son recouvrement et d'impliquer les cabinets africains. On peut avoir des cabinets au Kenya, des cabinets en Côte d'Ivoire, au Sénégal, qui vont réfléchir. En fait, il faut que nos dirigeants donnent une place à leur élite pour régler et traiter les problèmes qui concernent notre continent. C'est de cette seule façon que nous pouvons marquer notre souveraineté. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Let me first indicate that my recent role involved assisting African countries negotiate many agreements, but also sovereign debt, restructuring negotiations, and so on. I think our institution was the only institution in Africa established and only exclusively assisting African countries negotiate sovereign debt issues. That institution is the African Legal Support Facility, which was established by the African Development Bank. So I headed that institution until slightly over a year ago, and I can list for you all the debt issues we dealt with. This actually, the establishment of the institution originated from cases that African countries were faced with related to what is called vulture funds, which relates to secondary debt bought by offshore companies, which they impose against African countries. One of the most famous being the case of Zambia, Donegal 2007. So I thought I would comment on her paper in giving several indications on where maybe she could strengthen it. First of all, a description of that day. And first of all, let me also respond to what the Attorney General proposed yesterday. The Attorney General of Zambia proposed that we need to develop a kind of manual for assisting African countries negotiate. When I was at the institution, we actually developed that kind of manual. So it's called Understanding Sovereign Debt, Options and Opportunities for Africa. You can access it from the website of the institution, alsf.int, and you go to publications, just search for it. It's both in English and French. So one of the things that the publication helps is to identify what kind of debt do African countries have. So there are currently 4 types of debt: the multilateral, bilateral, commercial debt, and bond holders. A lot of the vulture fund type of debt originated from bond holders. The biggest victims of bond holders were the South American countries, Brazil, Venezuela, Argentina, particularly Argentina, but I won't go into that. But Professor highlighted one of those debts, which is the commercial debt in terms of contingent liabilities, the 3rd type I've mentioned. So in terms of improving her paper, I would say that she should separate the colonial type of debt, which is mainly the multilateral debt and some commercial debt, light with the current kind of debt. So and include emerging issues in debt. So where are the emerging issues in debt? A lot of the emerging issues in debt are in the commercial side and the bond holding, the commercial type of debt. Previously, the commercial type of debt, for instance, the contingent liabilities, was actually not included in our debt at IMF and World Bank. Somebody yesterday mentioned the Mozambique case. Actually, it was after the Mozambique case that they increasingly included the contingent debt. But there's another country I was assisting in the sub-region, for obvious reasons I can't mention it, which is saddled with that, but we don't have enough time to go into that. So that's an area where I think she needs to strengthen. Now, after COVID or during COVID, a new initiative came up. I should have mentioned that there is need in her paper also to highlight what happened during HIPIC. So that was the first initiative where we had debt forgiveness for the highly indebted countries. We had an alternative called multilateral debt review issues for the non-LDC countries. So I think that's a period she needs to mention. That type of debt is actually more related to the colonial debt. So for the more recent debt, we had a new initiative called DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative by the G20, but really mainly by the OECD countries. We labored, particularly with UNECA and AFDB, to try and create an initiative that would be more reflective of the needs of the African countries. In fact, Zambia is the first beneficiary of that DSSI. So that debt settled for Zambia, debt restructured for Zambia is under that initiative. The major problem with that initiative and why Zambia's debt restructuring took long was because the private debt holders were refusing to come on board. The private debt holders mainly relates to the commercial debt that I was mentioning and the bond holders. By the way, the commercial debt, I should also be including awards, arbitration awards. Those are huge. So in fact, under the facility, we successfully assisted at least 2 or 3 countries win arbitration cases, which they should have lost if we had not indicated, if we had not intervened. One of them, I mean, it's been in the press, was BSGR versus Guinea, a mining arbitration case where the BSGR was demanding 5 billion. So we actually saved Guinea from 5 billion. There are a few others, but we don't have time. So the commercial case, the commercial cases debt, you also divide it into those type of commercial arbitration awards, most of them opportunistic and sometimes sold off to become secondary debt, and the more contingent liability type that she was mentioning. So I think she needs to include that also in the paper. Now, there are also some more nuances. I think one nuance she's missing in terms of the assessment by the Bretton Woods institutions is the terminology. So there are several terminologies: debt sustainability, debt stress. So there are measurement of debt stress, and I think that's what she was trying to say, and one of the interlocutors was also trying to say. Their measurement of debt stress is based on their own parameters in terms of expectation as to whether you will be able to pay them or not. If you look at the countries that you categorize that have gone into debt stress on the continent, you'll actually realize that they fall in the category of non-LDC countries or states that are no longer entitled to, they term them as middle income countries, that are no longer entitled to concessional debt. So they start borrowing commercial debt. So one of those is the bonds, so the Euro bonds. So in fact, if you look at them, Zambia, Ghana, the ones that went into most those stress, and one other in Chad. The main issue was the borrowing of the bonds, borrowing through the bonds. And then the terms for the bonds, of course, are more stressful, but because they were categorized as middle countries, I sometimes laugh when I see African countries rushing to become middle countries. Why? China refused to be recognized as a non-developing. They continued claiming to be non-developing countries so that they continue enjoying those kind of concessional rates. So don't rush, just continue enjoying concessional rates. I would even say go back. So it's what you do with your resources, not what you are termed as. So maybe I've talked too long. I had other issues I wanted her to add on. I would say I continue. So in terms of what she has presented, the other issue is that in terms of what she has presented as her recommendations, I think they are brilliant. And I think that's what we need to add on to the book that I mentioned that my institution published, which is really a handbook explaining all the terminologies for lawyers and also non-lawyers. Some of them, I would admit, the non-lawyers would have difficulty understanding them, but they are useful for non-lawyers. Now, a comment on one of her recommendations. I love the recommendations on fiscal limits because at the moment, the fiscal limits, the 50% or whatever, are being set by the Bretton Woods institutions. The failure by us African countries to set the limit at constitutional level is one of the challenges. And I think setting the limit would also increase transparency. And then, of course, something was mentioned yesterday, which I think she should include in the constitutional reforms, is the approval of the debt commitments by the parliament. That would increase transparency. And I think 1 or 2 people mentioned that. But one of the challenges is that those constitutional provisions should include the description of the debt. At the moment, it's restricted to multilateral and bilateral debt for reporting to parliament. So I think that's one of the areas she should strengthen. Now, I agree with one of the comments in terms of the interlude on the independent debt management. I think that is difficult to create that in place. But one of the experiences I had across at least 30 African countries in the 10 years that I was in office is that almost 95 of them did not even have debt management offices. Even those that have set them up, they are managed by one or one man or one woman. So the first issue in debt management, which is well described in the book that we presented, is debt reconciliation. And the debt reconciliation at the moment started with the multilateral, bilateral, and all these other small debts, but excludes the commercial. I've talked too long. Okay, thank you. That's enough.
Thank you very much for such a brilliant contribution. I'll be sure to catch up with you afterwards so that I could get all the comments that you have on your papers. I had recognized Mukasiri thereafter, but after Mukasiri, I'll kindly extend an invitation to the Attorney General as well as the President of the Bar to just share a few comments and words towards this paper. So Mukasiri, you may go first. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So where I come from, if someone draws a beautiful snake, there is no need to add legs. But because I'm a Rastaman, I will add wings. So I just want to reflect more from the rear view mirror perspective, the kind of system that we are grappling with, and that structure that continues right now to suck our blood. From a legal perspective, we reached a stage where slavery was abolished, but the system compensates the slave owners, not the slaves. And we said, okay, today we are still grappling for reparation. This money that were being borrowed by the so-called developed country is money that was stolen assets from us. And here we are saying we owe the same people that plundered our resources from slavery, colonialism. Now look at the climate, the environment. For some reasons, I just want to bring the point that because value is very, very important. When you talk about debt, we get lost because we're talking about money and everything else. But debt even goes beyond money. Also, Botswana by value is the global lead producer of diamonds, followed by Russia, but by production, you invert that relationship, invest. Their currency is one of the most powerful globally and most stable currencies. It's called the Pula. It's named after Botswana's most precious resource. That's not diamond, it's rain. So what does it mean now when you destroy the very planet that should sustain our life in the name of profit? So I think that's something that we need to grapple with. Then Grieve, I just want also to bring you back to the conversation you started yesterday. As something a bit disruptive. Say, can we take debt to have the same treatment as equity in terms of the risk? Because if you are a shareholder, no profit, the company falls, you lose. But also, if you make it big, you also get big. So given the nature of our economies that are resource dependent, and particularly the revaluation that comes through the demand of critical minerals, is it a risk that you want to say that that boom would want them to have a part of? I mean, on the other side. So it might appear lucrative when you face the risk of debt, distress, or challenges that we're facing. But if you look at the potential side, upside, then you might see that we are also giving back, where we are also selling our continent in a way. So it brings me to my last point. Debt and tax are two sides of the same coin. In a way, debt is a deferred tax liability because you need to pay that debt that you've contracted, and with future tax revenue mainly. So in tax, we also cry of tax incentives. We also cry of rebates. There are also rebates also that are given for tax or credit, whatever. But also in terms of the broader governance improvement, looking at political, social, economic environment, why don't we also propose that to the financing cost, we have a rebate as a motivational issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will kindly extend invitation again to the Attorney General as well as the President of the Bar to just share a few words. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We are grateful for the paper presented by Dr. Hatif. Hatif, isn't? Yeah, I came while she had already started. There are quite a number of issues she has raised. We are here, I think for me, I'm in a privileged position because I'm Attorney General to deal with the country, to deal with government borrowing. I don't know how many are in those positions. And I wish it was a meeting of attorney generals and the ministers of justice. And my plea maybe is that PALU should organize such a forum for attorney generals. And I don't know about other jurisdictions. For our jurisdiction here, the attorney general knows dates which are being contracted. Whether it's IMF, I'm consulted. I must say yes or no. Even when we were discussing with the IMF, there were some conditions which IMF was asking. Secretary to the Treasury came to consult, and I said, this we can't do, this we can't do, this we can't do. And IMF, good enough, they said, if that's what the Attorney General is saying, then we'll still proceed and will not include those conditions the Attorney General has objected to. So I don't know how other jurisdictions operate. But this issue of debt crisis in Africa, and we are talking about the role of the legal profession. So we must get interested as lawyers what our countries are going through. And the issues which have been raised by Dr. Atif are crucial. Constitutional reforms, it's basically to do with the legal frameworks. Usually lawyers are more interested in challenging politicians. But why should you wait? Why stand on the fence, waiting to challenge politicians in court, taking them to court for what they have done wrong? Why don't we as lawyers be the originators of some of these reforms? Sometimes we think politicians have to make the reforms. It's us. We should not be on the fence waiting for politicians to make mistakes. So let's proceed and make reforms in some of those areas about transparency. How are the debt contracted? And we must be concerned about Africa. Where does the concern come from? My mother, her name is Dinah. She's 102 years old this year. She's still there, very strong. 2021, October 28th, when I was being sworn in, I sent my daughter to go and pick her from the village. She's illiterate, but very intelligent. So after my swearing in, I asked her, oh, Dinah, hey, from the village, you have come to State House, eh? She said, that thing, yeah. Then later, the president, I introduced her to the president. The president greeted her, the vice president greeted her, the minister of justice, the chief justice, and the senior members. And then we went for a photo session. After the photo session, I asked, Dinah, you owe me a chicken. She said, for what? I said, I've brought you to State House. You have been greeted by all these big people. Then she looked at me and she said, you owe me 10 chickens. I said, Dinah, why should I give you 10 chickens? She said, yes, because it's me who took you to school, which is a fact. So the question is, how many of us, it starts from there before we even get concerned about national dates. How many of us are looking after our parents? How many of us are looking after our old parents? You could have bought houses with swimming pools in your cities, but when you go to the village, where is your mother living? What is the structure? So when we start getting that responsibility from our own homes, then we can be appropriate even to look at what the nation is going through. That is your take-home pledge, that you look after your parents, and then you look after what the nation is going through. You can't be appropriate to look after national issues when your own family, you are failing to look after them. When your own family are not raising concerns. We start from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Attorney General. All right, thank you very much. I had one burning question here, then I'll take just one from here because we are running out of time. Very sorry about that. So please, yes, sir, please go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to reflect on the statement that the devil is in the contract. Now, my first question is there only one devil? Because sovereign debt or public debt, which is sovereign debt, affects sovereignty. Okay? How we vote in the United Nations, how we vote in the General Assembly, the Security Council, even how a country votes in the African Union to please the creditor, right? And that is not in the contract, is it? That obligation on how to vote in the United Nations Security Council and all the rest is not in the contract. So how can we say the devil is totally in the contract? It is not. That's my opinion. The other, and of course, we are not discussing this, are we? To get a debt structuring, a country is in debt crisis has to please the creditors, right? So none of this is being discussed. How do we please the creditor? And how does this affect our sovereignty and so on? Because you don't go into a negotiation and just negotiate only there and finish it. You have to do all other things. That is not being discussed. I don't think. And the other is responsible lending. Well, a colleague there talked about vulture debts and so on, the commercial debts that are public. These are companies from which bonds are bought, and they are interested in getting paid. They are interested in getting paid. But countries, creditor countries, the big ones, are they interested in getting paid, or are they using the debt for another end? Because most of the countries are not interested in getting paid, in fact. As long as you service the debt, it's all right, because they want you under the leash. You are there to be dictated, right? So to hope that they will be responsible in their lending, they are not cash strapped. They don't really need your money, do they? They need, their purpose is different. So that aspect, I think, has to be fully discussed also. So the thing I think is that the lawyer's role is very limited, because after all, the lawyer, this is a question of negotiation. And if you are weak and in a very weak negotiation position, whatever idea the lawyer presents cannot be enforced. It depends on how, what your negotiation position is. I want just you to comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment. I'm sure the panelists, as well as Dr. Leila Latif, will respond. I'll take just one last question, and I have a burning one right at the back. So please go ahead. Yes.
Thank you very much. It will be a very short comment, really. First, next time you're looking for a resource person, please remember the gentleman over there. He was very knowledgeable. Now, on every deliberation I've heard today, it is Africa as usual, deflecting blame. We are very skillful at that. We need the colonialists to blame for our every act of incompetence. I think transformation will only begin if we can introspect and address incompetence, hubris, and abdication. We choose incompetent leaders. A 93-year-old will win in Cameroon, I suspect. We choose people because we like them, and we abdicate the role of borrowing to them, and we do not check on them. That's why we are in debt traps. We are very, very good at finding fault in others. I learned as a Christian to blame the devil for my sins, which I planned myself. So can we change for once and take blame and address the faults that we're causing on ourselves? Thanks.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. So I'll just ask the panelists to briefly, very briefly, respond to some of the comments, questions given, as well as Dr. Leila, if she's still with us, I'm not so sure. And then we can just close this up. But definitely we will need to have further discussions during the tea break, so that we can see how we can further improve this paper. Thank you very much for your contributions. Dr. Chelwa, I'll go with you first.
Thank you, Mistress of Ceremonies. I'll be very quick. The last thing I just want to disagree a little bit with the elder statesman at the back there. We have to understand we're creatures of history, right? We speak, the languages we speak, for crying out loud, are colonial languages. The law, essentially the law that we are discussing today, is much of it is either common law, but exactly 60 years later. But I agree with you. We have to, and I think the point that has to be made is, you're right, we need to transform ourselves and grow, but we can't understand where we are today without thinking about the mess that the so-called colonial people left to us. I mean, the Congo, for crying out loud, arguably the richest country in the world, is in the state that it's in today because of the Belgians. Well, I mean, the Belgians left Mobutu. Mobutu for 30 years ruled that country like a fiefdom. Before that, it was Leopold who ruled it like a private estate. You can't understand the tragedy of that country without grappling with that history. Similarly, Zambia, you can't understand Zambia's situation there without thinking about history. I told you that, but we have to understand this. I think the point to make, I agree with you, sir. We got to move forward. But to move forward, we've got to grapple with the past and accept that we are creatures of that past and accept our faults. Okay, that is it. Thank you so much. And all this is fascinating conversation, and I've learned so much from here. And I'm actually very pleased that the Attorney General is here. I've learned a lot from him as well. I'm glad to hear that he said no to some conditions, right? So more of that, more of that. Thank you.
I was actually going to reflect on that last point made by the Attorney General in terms of being able to lead the pushback. And he also said something very key, which is that if there were more Attorney Generals who are listening to these conversations, then they have more information to help them to be able to make the informed decisions when these requests are made from different stakeholders. And we can learn from Latin America, for instance, in negotiation of free trade areas, FTAs, with the US. The US had this sneaky practice of including a very wide coverage, the definition of investment covered under this agreement to include sovereign debt. But a number of Latin American countries during negotiations with the US insisted during the negotiations, kicked against it, and ensured that there were carve-outs so that this, if there were any issues relating to sovereign debts or related instruments, that it did not go to ISDS mechanisms. So African countries need to take responsibility, and I think that leads back to what Leonard Statesman mentioned behind. We need to take responsibility and be informed and also push back when these requests are made that are not favorable to our people. So it is important that we have the people who are in key positions being informed by those who are producing or generating the information or the research like Dr. Latif's work. But more importantly, that they speak up when push comes to shove in these negotiations. We will not all be there, but the Honorable Attorney General will be in rooms, he will be in places where he can speak for the Zambian people. And that goes across for other policymakers and politicians across the continent. So we need to work together and collaborate to be able to give the necessary, and I think that's what this research is proposing to do, to provide the kind of work that those who would have the conversations at high level are able to use to be able to push back against policies that do not favor the ordinary person. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grieve. Thank you very much, Dr. Ohio. I'll kindly ask Dr. Leila Latif to just share a few words, then back to me. Thank you, Dr. Latif.
Thank you so much. You know, this is the moment I feel really, really terrible not being there in person, because the level of engagement has been so enriching. And I can't help but thank my panelists. Honestly, Dr. Chelwa, Dr. Omiuno, for your fantastic contribution on how I can go back and rework this paper so that these arguments that you talked about and the counter arguments that you've given me comes out very clearly. And to the audience, you know, it's really fantastic engagement. I really wish we had more time to be able to hear more views, especially from the gentleman from the African Legal Support Facility helping with the drafting of the manual, and everybody else comment on this. So I just want to say thank you, and for your time, for your commitment, for the discussions that you've helped us with in terms of understanding the nature of public debt. But it's also to, you know, reinforce the view that we really need to understand where we were and where we are today. And that entire transition about how we got from where we were to where we are today, and where are these challenges, where are these obstructions, what do we need to do better so that we're getting our sovereignty back, right? Because that at the end of the day is the key issue. And lawyers, we have a role to play. So I don't want to get into the argument about the devil being in the details, because, you know, there are nuances to that. But as lawyers, we really have a role to play in guiding our states, in guiding our parliamentarians, right? And also guiding civil society on what are the key things that we need to look out for when we're allowing our representatives in government to go and negotiate some of these debts that will have some consequences. So without much further ado, thank you for listening. And Samantha, thank you. Back to you. Thanks, discussants as well. Hopefully we'll be able to engage on email soon.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leila. My apologies for the French speakers. I understand there was no French translation for this last part, but Dr. Leila really thanks all of you for your input, and she hopes that we can be able to have a much perfected version of this paper. At this point, I'd like to call upon my colleague, Mr. Adrian Chikore, He's the policy analyst and advocacy officer for international public and private finance with AfroDebt. So he is going to be giving a few closing remarks. As Mr. Adrian Chikore comes up, let me just say this paper was on the legal foundations of debt and underlining foundations. For us to understand what the real foundations are, we need to trace back our history, where the state question started, how it ended up where we are today, and how we can then move forward. I think that's the whole point of, our history lessons from high school even. And just to say, if we are to take anything from this, debt is a contractual relationship. Therefore, as lawyers, we have a huge role to play. It may be limited for some, it may not be limited for some, but there is a role that we can play to ensure that we are at the negotiation table and we influence some of the decisions that are taking place. I would not be from AfroDebt if I wouldn't say the goal is to make Africa the rule maker and not the rule taker. Over to you, Adrian.
Thank you, our esteemed panelists. I'm the guy holding you between yourselves and your tea. I'll try and make it as quick as I can. But first things first, I would like to thank the panelists, Dr. Leila Latif, the Attorney General, for giving us some great insights with regards the nexus between the legal issues around the debt crisis within Africa and likely Zambia as well. But look, there are a number of things that as AfroDebt we had noticed that led us to this kind of forum. As the Attorney General highlighted, should we be still engaging politicians when we see or know of their capacity challenges? And that was part of the bigger kind of question to then say, let's have a legal department that looks at data analysis and advocacy within the region. And this is where we are. But what's most important about us being here is, given that we've noted the gap that we see within civil society around the governance around debt within the African continent, the legal fraternity is very important in ensuring that the issues and challenges that we face around transparency, the lack of capacity in negotiating, amongst other things, within the contracting of loans is key. We then got to this point that then we need to foster collaborations amongst and within our various spaces that we influence. And rightly so, as the Attorney General highlighted, can't there be a caucus of Attorney Generals to assist us in engaging in these kind of discussions? And I take this ball to our conveners, Palu, Dawn and team, to then say, let's engage, let's shape information platforms, and then try and engage the creditors that we are facing challenges with, so that we can at least move towards the kind of just transition we need for African countries, as well as the Africa we want when it comes to governance of debt and macroeconomic stability within the country. So with these few words, and given the time that we've taken in discussing within this session, I would want to put this session to a close, but likely thanking you colleagues for the discussions, active discussions and participation that we've had. And for those who might have felt vindicated or who feel vindicated that they couldn't speak, let's try and have a caucus outside, either in the evening or in the afternoons, so that we can further these discussions, network, and then ensure that we can keep moving and ensure that the African continent gets to be in a position that moves us towards sustainable debt management within the continent. So with these few words, I would like to thank you, and please give yourselves over to you. Thanks, Samantha. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. I've been Samantha and you've been the audience. Thank you very much. This was the Legal Foundations on Debt paper.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Just a reminder that we also have another side session in here at 12 o'clock, 12 to 1:30, where we are going to be looking at litigating sovereign debt issues. So just a reminder, we are here again soon. Thank you.